morning. I'm actually from the Official History at the Australian War Memorial, both the previous series and the current series. But I'm talking to you today as a person who spent a significant amount of time looking at wartime economics and finance. Following Vice Admiral Peter Jones and before Commodore Matt Buckley, I'm not going to talk about Navy operations per se, so if that's what you want out of this paper, this is not going to be a help. But I am going to build on themes that were explored by both Mark Bailey and John Blackburn this morning. Okay. The current environment is fairly uncertain. We have a range of potential ways to describe it. ASPI is currently describing it as hot peace with Chinese strategic control of the South China Sea, in which Australian trade operates either under Chinese sufferance or escort or is rerouted out. We've also got grey zone activities which affect Australian trade routes, in this context small regional conflicts near to but excluding Australia, or non-state actor threats like piracy, or small regional conflicts elsewhere like the Persian Gulf, which can have massive ramifications on our trade. There's also the potential for war, either regional involving us or global conflict. In any of these scenarios, we still obviously need international maritime trade, both for reasons of economic sustainment of Australia, which we're calling maritime trade now, and including the balance of payments and consumer goods. But we also, from a strategic perspective, need sea supply, which is a recent term that we've coined to mean a strategic supply for the nation, as opposed to sustainment and logistic supply of troops. And this includes materials, materiel, and any alternatives that are being sourced for production of key materials and goods. One of the big factors that we have, current and immediate, in the economy regarding the rising tensions is the implication of how on earth our maritime fleet is going to get any war risk insurance. This is a direct implication of any of those types of conflict. Increased premiums with either known insurers or, as this becomes increasingly unlikely, the search for new insurance options. It's not just affecting us in the Gulf, as has been seen in the last few weeks. It's not just affecting us in the South China Sea, and it's not just affecting us. It's affecting others. It's affecting them in the Western Indian Ocean, which is just as important to our maritime trade routes as both the Gulf and the Straits of Malacca. And loss of maritime shipping in each of these areas means that trade will be affected in volume because we need to find new trade routes that take longer, in potential loss of key trade groups, key trade goods, in potential loss of direct loss of vessels, and then in the need for recovery operations. It's become such a sustained problem that some of the main insurers in the game, who have been around for a long time, like Lloyd's, are actually considering whether or not they can really continue in this space. This is far from the only economic issue, and while John Blackburn has talked already on petroleum, I'd like to bring to the fore something that is a little less well known, a little less immediately visible, but also an incredibly vulnerable point of supply for us. And falls under the bracket of sea supply. We do not currently have a reliable, substantial domestic supply of phosphates and fertilisers, but phosphates in particular. Australia actually uses a lot of phosphate. We import it, we have some local production. It is a key requirement for agriculture. Nothing grows without phosphates. And Australia has phosphate-poor soil. While we actually export phosphates to Southeast Asia, it's only in its processed form. We get the raw material, most of it, from overseas. That's about 75% of our fertiliser needs from phosphate, because most of the rock in Australia is too low grade and too hard to access, making it economically unviable. Have a look at where we're accessing it from. We have a choice of the majority of it coming from China, which obviously is a problem now, and also from Morocco, which Those of you who know our Australian military history know that there has in fact been a peacekeeping operation in Morocco for well over 30 years now. This has been a historical problem for us, so we know what happens when we don't have enough phosphate. It's not a new strategic problem. Our needs in World War II were supported from Nauru, Christmas Island and Ocean Islands until German enemy raiders actually made an attack on both the British phosphate shipping that we were reliant on and also the port in Nauru. We lost nearly half the fleet and half our supply. And this was even before the Japanese actually took those islands, at which point we lost all of them. At this point, we had to source our phosphate from much further away, places like Florida and from Northern Africa, or what we now know as Western Sahara in Morocco. These longer trade routes involved huge amounts of risk to the crews bearing them, higher insurance premiums, and as a result, reduced supplies. Let's take a look at how this actually affected our production in the Second World War of agriculture, right at the time when we're not just trying to sustain ourselves, but most of the Americans in the Southwest Pacific. It's an enormous problem that if we can't get our phosphates, our agriculture is directly impacted. Our stockpiles as they are right now will not see us through a full annual farming cycle, let alone one in a drought. And the situation is much the same for nitrites and the other fertilisers we're reliant on. If we have these sorts of problems, okay, in a higher strategic environment that's going to involve things like higher costs of maritime risk, higher paying for imports, higher cost to export, okay, we're also going to have the problem of how we're going to pay for it. These are the current costs of recent operations. They look enormous to the untrained eye. But this is what they're like in context. Okay, if we're serious about thinking about war, and we're serious about thinking about war in a contested environment, we're not just looking here, okay, or here where our maritime supply was not at all threatened. We're looking here. Look at the cost and the amount of GDP that's required. There's only a limited number of ways we can pay for it. The most common one that we probably know is that our taxes pay for it. High taxes in time of war are almost unavoidable. They will go up by 10 to 15%, but they're also highly unpopular, and very few governments will sustain unpopular policies. We can also look at issues of inflation. We can potentially devalue the dollar and use inflation as a way to kind of write off the value of these debts that we're going to be incurring, because we're also going to have to leverage loans from the domestic population potentially, either compulsorily, disguised as secondary taxes, or directly through efforts like war bonds. The problem with these things is that the domestic market is quite limited in its financial opportunities. Not only that, but issues of things like higher taxes are unpopular, and inflation is also equally unpopular. Nobody wants their dollar to stretch, to retract in its value. So we're likely to start looking the way that we have most recently at options for funding from overseas. We can look at things like loans or grants from international sources, noting where our current investment flows come from, which are going to be a strategic problem. Even though much of our investment is from the US, we get lots of big chunks from places that aren't so friendly. We can look at offsets by trade, which actually really saved our financial situation in the Second World War, through the examples of things like Lend-Lease and, most importantly for us, reciprocal Lend-Lease. This has the added bonus of making us, as a minor ally, a much more important value to our larger allies, because we become a basis of supply. The last one, which always I think is quite popular in Navy circles in particular, is plunder. And I'm serious, in dollars or goods. In the current context, this means things like finding out sources of terrorist supply of financing and stopping that and potentially seizing the finances involved. But we've also historically done things like closed investment banks from countries that have had investment banks in Australia and seized the goods and property of people who've lived in Australia. And this is before we consider things like capturing of materiel and reuse against the enemy. So how do we leverage our recent experience? Obviously not wanting to tread on the toes of the next speaker, I've limited it at my discussion of the operational to this. Okay, first, we can look at recent operations like Operation Slipper and Manitou, and I apologise for the misspelling there. Enforcing sanctions and protection, including search and clearing and including escort, particularly of the operation that's going to go forward. We can enforce sanctions, we can do drug interdiction, we can do anti-piracy. We have experience in these things. That doesn't mean we have experience in recent experience, living memory experience, actual experience of things like convoy yet. We also need to bear in mind that we have significant structural issues in the Navy from recent years, and this includes things like a Navy that is sparingly funded at a percentage of 2% of our GDP and is undermanned. What we can do though is we can bear in mind that our allies actually have much more experience than we do in protecting maritime trade, specifically in wartime. So we can look at things like the tanker war, where the US was actually running convoy operations. We can look to those in our regions who are currently conducting anti-piracy in the Straits of Malacca and leverage their experience in the environment that is contested right now in a space between us and the South China Sea. And we can work with those who have the most to gain, our key trading partners like Japan and South Korea. We can also think about leveraging recent technologies that could allow us to more effectively protect trade. Hardening merchant ships is something that we did a lot in the First and Second World War, and it may be something we need to revisit. Perhaps with something like this container-based unit from BAE Systems, an adaptive deck launcher. Assuming a convoy situation, if Australian assets are providing targeting, these could be a huge force multiplier. We can also leverage on our recent experience of financing war, in this case of our allies. You'll note that in real dollar terms, Afghanistan was second only to World War II for the United States, mostly through loans and some taxation, which has resulted in an enormous debt for the United States. This is reminiscent of the First World War rather than the Second, and a major factor in the First World War scenario for creating the Great Depression. We also have to understand the limitations that we have in our war financing into the future. For example, the size of our government debt, how much debt is held overseas. Oops, have I gone too far? I have. Okay, how much is held overseas, and what the appetite is for Australian government securities, which is falling. We also need to think about how mobilisation is possible in a stagnant economy, because funnily enough, we've already done this in 1937 to 1939. Then we should be thinking about the previous experiences we have in providing insurance for maritime trade. This has happened most recently when the Australian government stepped in after 9/11, mostly for airports, but also in a real way. There was some discussion of potentially for maritime supply. I have not found any examples of engagement with this right now, and if we plan on using flags of convenient vessels or even a domestic fleet, this will only escalate as an issue. I haven't found any more recent discussion than this. Other countries are already doing this. Singapore and the Hong Kong and China option are two that are immediately visible. We also need to think about what we're doing for key trade goods that are not damaged but are lost through sinking, and whether we are going to be recovering those and what sort of protection those might need. We can also leverage on recent experiences of plunder. This is what has been done with assets captured. We obviously have some experience of this, and we have some experience in capture and disposal of enemy assets. Most recently, Canada has taken the lead with doing this by seizing the goods of Iran. So where does this leave us? Any plans for future maritime trade need to answer these questions. Okay, on a strategic basis, we actually need a strategic plan. This has to do things like, for example, take into account the supply of maritime trade vessels, the planning for disruption to trade, and beyond what this means for the supply of the ADF, i.e. proper sea supply and the supply of Australia in emergency. We need scenarios for the provision of war risk insurance and rerouting of trade, and we need a way to pay for this. We also need to put this firmly back in the front of the strategic policy environment. We need to go beyond things like the white paper, the most recent one of which said that the answer to all of our maritime trade woes would be found in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, that didn't survive for 6 months after the white paper was produced. We also need to recognise that we're not alone. And a lot of the discussion seems to be about what is Australia doing and only Australia doing. We need to think about how we can leverage our allies because we're never going to be big enough to do this alone. We also need to recognise that the Navy will need to upskill, and they're going to need to do it on convoy. They're going to need to think about how they're going to assist in hardening merchant vessels, and they're going to need to think about what their role might be in the recovery of strategic goods. Thanks very much for your time.